like I should move a bit closer. I feel it is, isn't it? I'm always doing this. Calm here, I should say. Fitting an archive. So just to check, do we have audio and video live?
Live, yeah.
Jolly good. Welcome everybody to this part of our talk series at London Metropolitan Archives, this one entitled Colours and Shapes. My name is Tom Ferber, and I'm an Engagement Learning Officer here at London Metropolitan Archives. Just a few pieces of housekeeping before we start the talk properly. The first is to say, as maybe is apparent by now, that this is a hybrid event, so as well as the audience here in person, so welcome if you're here in person, we're also streaming live as well, so welcome if you're joining us from home or anywhere else where you have an internet connection. In terms of housekeeping, for those of you who have joined us in person, just to say we're not expecting the fire alarm to go off today. So should the fire alarm go off, we need to leave the building and we'll just evacuate via the doors to the back of the room, down the main set of stairs and go out that way. And the loos, if you've not just found them, are back through the doors and tucked in the corner of the exhibition space. And for those of you at home, I should, in terms of housekeeping, just to say my colleague Jack is ably looking after the live stream and the chat as well. So hopefully that's all functioning okay in terms of sound, in terms of vision. If you have any problems, please feel free to pop that in the chat and we'll try and get them rectified for you as best as possible. Jack always hates it when I say this, and do let us know as on the fly, as it were. There's nothing worse than we thinking we've done this right, everything's good, and we find out, an hour later that there's no sound or no picture or something like that. So we'd much rather try and fix something along the way.
I'm already being admonished for forgetting to turn the sound on. So
okay, very good. So Jack's already been admonished. So situation normal. Very good. Okay. And just to say, there will be time for questions, both from those of you who've joined us in person and those joining us online as well. We'll save questions at the end, but there'll be plenty of opportunity to ask questions and comments and the like. So now on to the topic at hand. So this is one of a whole series of talks we've been doing about our map collection here at London Metropolitan Archives. The catalyst being we've had since April last year, we've had an exhibition here, Magnificent Maps of London, looking at some of the very small section of the very many thousands, literally thousands of maps we hold in our archive collection here. And these talks, which are the fourth Tuesday of the month, are an opportunity for us to dig a little bit deeper into some of the maps that are on display, and also have a look at some of the maps that didn't quite make it out. And I've tried to arrange these talks thematically to bring out different aspects and different angles of the collection that we didn't have a chance to do in the exhibition. And today I thought we'd have a different way of sorting the collection, and that's to look at maps that don't just sort of describe the topography, they don't just describe what London has looked like at any given point in its history, but they try to communicate something else with their mapping. And they do this often with the use of colour and the use of shape. So we're going to think about maps that tell us a little bit more than just what is where this afternoon. We're going to cover a range of different subjects. We're going to start in the middle of the 19th century, the map that's on display behind us, and we're going to finish actually about 100 years later, in the middle of the 20th century. And as I say, the only thing that connects the maps is their use of colours and shapes to tell different stories. And perhaps we could, if we wanted to draw a narrative, perhaps we could talk about changing cities, changing cityscapes, and experiences of kind of the urban. But that might be me overthinking it, as I do sometimes. So let us start with a very famous map. Indeed, I dare say some of you with us today will recognise this map. This is the famous John Snow cholera map. You'll also hear it called the ghost map as well. It's a famous map in terms of its history, both in terms of history of epidemiology, its history of London history, and actually the history of presenting visual information as well. It really is quite the celebrity in the sort of the limited space of a map can be a celebrity. And like with any sort of celebrity, it kind of grows in its telling. A certain mythos can develop around a map such as this. So you will hear quite exaggerated claims from time to time about this map. This is the map that, without a doubt, proved the link between cholera and dirty water. This is the map that gave Jon Snow his eureka moment linking cholera with the spread of dirty water and not the prevailing theory of miasma. Well, here, some of those exaggerations, some of those are exaggerations, but there is a kernel of truth which those exaggerations have grown. So let's think a little bit more about this map in detail then. So the context of this map was for what was in 19th century London a new and terrifying disease. So cholera comes to London in the in sort of the 1820s from India via the north of England, and it's a new disease and it's a terrifying disease. It's likened to the plague, it's likened to the Black Death. It becomes known as the Blue Death. This rather grim description, being that if you have cholera, you suffer very severe vomiting, very severe diarrhea, which in turn leads to dehydration. This leads to a thickening of the blood, which leads to deoxygenization, and then a horrible blue pallor ensues, and hence the blue death. The means of transmission of cholera was unknown in the early years of its arrival in London. Various theories propounded, but they weren't fully understood, and the ignorance over its means of transmission and the fact that you could go from perfectly fit and able at breakfast time to dead by dinner time meant that it really struck fear into the hearts of Londoners, and quite understandably so. The pattern for cholera was a series of epidemics spaced about 10 years apart, from the 1830s to the 1850s and onwards. And the prevailing theory that cholera was spread by what was called miasma, and that's bad air, so bad smells. London in the 19th century was a tremendously smelly place. It was a city that had grown tremendously in the first half of the 19th century and beyond, and there were problems with sanitation, there were problems with the managing of industrial waste, they were managing it was a city that was growing organically unplanned, with a whole series of problems around cleanliness and hygiene and pollution. So it was a city of foul smells, and not unreasonably, there was some assumption that these foul smells were in fact a cause of disease. Of course, if you are trying to prevent an epidemic, it's very important to know what is causing the epidemic, and some of the early ways of both curing cholera in terms of treating a person and preventing the epidemic were unsuccessful because they were based on this false theory. There was, and this is one of those stories where we do have that idea of the lone genius or the lone iconoclast being right along is prevalent. So, as I say, the prevailing theory was that cholera was caused by miasma, by bad air. One John Snow, a fairly young doctor at this stage, had a different theory. So John Snow believed that cholera was caused not by bad air, but by something transmitted in water. And this is where we have to do a little bit of myth busting about this map before we tell the story properly. So you'll sometimes hear about this map, that this is the map that proved to John Snow and proved to the wider world the link between cholera and waterborne transmission. That's not so. So as early as 1832, John Snow was doubting the received wisdom about the transmission of cholera being by miasma. He noticed that miners were getting sick. The community he was working with in Killingworth, miners were getting sick from cholera, whereas sewage workers won't. So obviously, in that situation, it will be the sewage workers that were encountering more of this bad air, this miasma, than the miners, and the pattern of morbidity didn't follow the exposure. It was a theory he published in 1849 in a book called On the Mode of Communication of Cholera, where he again made this link between waterborne transmission explicit, and it was dismissed by the medical establishment. Come 1854, there's another outbreak of cholera, and a particularly virulent outbreak around Broad Street in Soho, and John Snow once again wants to advance his theory about the way the cholera is transmitted, and in order to help evidence this theory, he makes meticulous records of where the cases of cholera are to be found, and then a year later, so again just disproving that myth, that this is the map that proves it to the population. A year later, in 1955, this sort of retrospective map of his studies, investigations, is published. And with that rather long intro, we can now have a bit of a look at the detail of the map itself. So, say published in 1855, and here we can see not colours, because it is of course a monochrome, but we can see the addition of shapes to tell the story. So the black bars that you can see, you might be able to make out the key at the bottom there. The black bars represent deaths from cholera. Depending on which way they're orientated, horizontal or vertical, that indicates whether the people that died there were residents of that location. And you can probably make out in the zoomed in portion on the top right hand side there that there is a cluster. So that is Broad Street, the main road running along there, where you can see a cluster of these deaths. So these are recorded deaths of cholera. There's a few details to point out this map which further help prove John Snow's theory, or further help advance John Snow's theory, I should say. One is the shaded patch along there. On the full-size version on the left-hand side, I wouldn't expect anyone's eyes are good enough to read that. That is describing the supposed location of the plague pit. And the idea being that part of the reason that this was particularly an outbreak was the foul air, the miasma, was raising from this supposed plague pit. But we can see that actually there are more, although there are deaths in that supposed cloud, there are deaths outside it as well, and they are not evenly spread throughout the area. If the means of communication or mode of communication, to use John Snow's phrasing, was air, we would expect an even spread. But we can see from the lines there, there's something else happening in terms of the spread of the disease. We can see the epicenter of it is marked pump. Those little circles are pumps, so you can see the epicenter of it is around that. There's also two sort of prevailing cases which actually further advanced John Snow's argument. The first is that we can see the bottom right of the zoomed image there. That says Huggins Brewery. So in the Huggins Brewery, there were 70 workmen there, and John Snow spoke with the eponymous Mr. Huggins and found out that although these 70 workmen were there were only two cases of cholera, and neither of them were severe. And what John Snow realised is people at the brewery drink water. There's no prize for guessing what you drink if you work in a brewery. You drink beer, or malt liquor, as it's described in John Snow's notes. So because they're drinking beer, not water, they escape the ravages of the disease. And the second sort of countervailing case is that in the top middle of the zoomed in map on the right-hand side, you might be able to make out as workhouse. Although there are 5 bars there representing of course a number of fatalities, this is a lot less than you'd expect for an institution of this size. And further investigation turned out that the workhouse there had its own water supply. It had a well to drink from. They weren't going to the Broad Street pump. And then the final sort of piece of compelling evidence, certainly we can see retrospectively, is that there are some fatalities not marked on this map, one in Hampstead, one in Islington, and we find out rather tragically that a lady in Hampstead enjoyed the taste of the Broad Street pump water, so had it brought to her specially and gave some to her niece. Both of those related in death as well. So by this means that we would think, of course, that was conclusive proof of the spread of cholera. Sadly, it was still rejected by the medical establishment, and it wasn't until around about 20 years later that this link was proved between sort of microorganism and the spread of the disease. So this is a response to one problem of urban living. And our next map, and now we have some colour to coincide with our shapes, is a similar. Is similar in origins perhaps. So these are called the Goad insurance plans, and it's another way to use mapping to respond to work with the challenges of greater urban density, of new buildings, of really effectively a new form of living. So the Goad insurance plans are named after one Charles E. Goad, born in Surrey, moved to Canada, and then moved back, and started publishing these maps in the 1880s in London. And what they are is they are very detailed town plans, and they are designed to be used by those in the insurance market to properly assess fire risk in particular, and to make their the actuarial decisions based on the information contained within these. So they are incredibly detailed. We tend to think of the Ordnance Survey in this country as the gold standard for detailed mapping. These include a level of detail beyond even the Ordnance Survey, and they are particularly useful in terms of how buildings are used and how they were constructed as well. So they're a very good source for those kinds of information. Goad published these town plans for cities across Canada and then across the UK, ranging from Dover, which is covered with only 8 sheets, and 500 sheets for London. So a tremendously sort of thorough and exhaustive exercise in surveying and mapping. What we have here is an insurance plan of the city of London. We can see in the middle that this is the key plan effectively. So this is to each of those numbers, 64, 65, 66, and so on, in the coloured areas there, represents a different section of the city. And if you're interested in that section of the city, you would obviously leave to that page. And one nice feature of these maps, which is, I'm afraid, slightly lost if we're experiencing them digitally, but is quite apparent on the physical versions, is the way that they were updated. So we're used to thinking of with maps being, an 1885 edition, 1895 edition, and so on and so forth. So additions of the maps corresponding to particular dates. That wasn't the approach that Goad took. Rather, for these maps, his company would update sections of the map a bit at a time. So if there was a new construction, if something was demolished and something new was built, that new area would be surveyed, and they'd send you just enough. It's a little piece of paper, just enough to put over that, and so you literally cut and paste it over the new section there. So when you have the physical maps, you can actually see the layers pasted on each other. And that wasn't done in any kind of systematic fashion. It was done, as I say, according to need. And the top left-hand side of this image, you can see revised in. So this one hasn't been revised, but you can see that what you can do there is you can fill in, or someone on behalf of the Goad company can fill in the dates of the revisions there. So a nice sort of analog version, something we're perhaps a bit more familiar with in a digital manner. Again, I don't expect everyone's eyes enough to see it. We've got it zoomed on the next slide. And then you can see on the left-hand side, and then snaking across the bottom there is a very detailed set of symbols and descriptors that are used to describe the topography in the building of London. And happily for me, when putting this talk together, they use both colours and shapes. So what we have here is the on the left-hand side, and then running across the middle there. So this is a bit of a busy slide. It was quite hard to think of a way to get all this information on something like a neat fashion. We can see there, we can see the various information there. Not perhaps expecting people to take it in all in one go. This, and actually every map that we're using in today's talk, is available online, mostly at the London Picture Archive, so you could use that reference number to find it if you wanted to, and some which will cover on Layers of London as well. But we can see the main standout features are, firstly, all the buildings are pink here, so the map will tell us that these are brick or stone built buildings. It's what we'd expect. So that's the that's the Royal of England, the Royal Exchange, the Bank of England. So big, prestigious properties. This is the City of London, really at the height, or approaching the height of its wealth and power. It's very much the imperial capital, or coming to be the imperial capital at this time, with all the perhaps some of the moral complications that come with it, which were of course slightly glossed over at the time. So we're seeing brick-built buildings. On other sheets, you might see a combination of brick or stone in pink and wood in yellow. Yellow being wood, wood being a greater fire risk, so you can make those deductions visually. And then additional features, the blue circles and squares that we see on top of the buildings are skylights and windows. So we see the Royal Exchange in the middle of the right-hand image there. We already get a sense of what that's going to be like. That's a big, bold skylight, befitting such a prestigious building. If one was to zoom in closely, we'd even see little hatched lines delineating the openings of this skylight. This is the level of detail that we are dealing with. And again, if we could zoom in very closely, we would see that the individual shops are marked as shops and the use of the property is noted. And then the blue circles that we see dotted about, it's after all a fire insurance map, are to do with these are fire hydrants there. Again, so if you're assessing the risk of fire of this building, you have a lot of important information at your fingertips there. So again, a very, very detailed map that, again, one that rewards close study, and we can see how colour and shape and other symbols indeed as well are used to sort of to communicate its message. This is probably another sort of mapping celebrity. I dare say some of you will be familiar with this map as well. So this is the famous Booth map. Again, I suppose this theme of understanding the urban landscape comes to the fore. So the the Booth map, this is the map we see on the right-hand side, or the Booth, or to give it its sort of proper name, Charles Booth Descriptive Map of London Poverty, is a map version of a truly monumental 17-volume study into the conditions of the working and material conditions of Londoners in the closing decades of the 19th century. Charles Booth was a businessman and later sort of social scientist who was part of a sort of somewhat radical progressive set, and effectively got into an argument with someone who claimed that a quarter of London's population lived in poverty. And Charles Booth realised that he didn't think that was right. He wanted to dispute the point, but he didn't actually have any scientific basis to which to do that. And so, rather commendably, went out to find that information in a project that really consumed the rest of his life, or certainly his non-commercial life. So, accessing various data sources, including the records of the London School Board, and then commissioned his own investigations. He effectively went door to door, or him and his team went door to door, inquiring into the living conditions of the people of London. And as I say, it's 17 volumes when it sits on the shelves, but this is the most famous product. And what you can see, leaps out about this map is the colour coding. So, as the basis of these investigations, the people of London were divided into, I think, eight distinct sort of classes based on their wealth. Each of these classes was given a colour code shared between some of the lower classes. So the yellow or gold areas, fittingly enough, are the wealthiest residents of London. The red represent the middle class, and then the shades of dark blue, dark blue, purple, and black represent the poorest. It feels a little jarring to a modern ear, perhaps. The black there are described as vicious and semi-criminal. We do see this theme of kind of the corrosive effects of poverty on people's character is a theme through Charles Booth's work. A few formal points of note before we have a bit more detailed look at this map. Notice how the yellow is predominantly on the west end, and as we go east, we see more middle class and more blue and black, representing that sort of perhaps well-known distinction between the west and the east ends of London. Also notice how there is a big void in the middle of this map where the City of London is. So one of the big changes that happens in London in the 19th century is that the City of London becomes depopulated. So much so that it wasn't deemed worth the effort to do this survey in the city, and that's largely because of the railways. The development of railways allowed something like modern commuting to emerge. So here we can see the maps in a little bit more detail. That map view we saw on the previous page was actually a composite map of the individual components of the map stitched together. So there are four maps in total, one dealing with the northwest, northeast, southwest, and southeast, of course. And you can see on this image on the left-hand side, you can see that colours the colour code along the bottom there. And on the right-hand side, that top right-hand image is zoomed in around a parish in Bermondsey. This was chosen this selection as I've used it as a part of some family history research, or I should say one of my colleagues used it as part of their family history research, and I pilfered it to give a more honest description of the situation. And if we take a look at this zoomed in section, as I say, it's around in Bermondsey, it gives us a sense of some of the complexities of the sort of geography of poverty in Victorian London, as well as giving an insight into quite how detailed Booth's survey was. So we can see that along the main roads, red, remember, is middle class, we can see that the better housing or the better living conditions are along the main roads. And then the further we go off the main roads, often the worse things get. Think about those images of Victorian London around slums and around the famous rookeries as well. This very Dickensian idea, or Mayhew if you prefer non-fiction, of going off the beaten track and things becoming dark, becoming shadowy, becoming dangerous. You can see that. Very much in these maps here. Also, we can think about how it's sort of common sense really, how if you back onto a tannery, so just where it says St Mary Magdalene, if you go up there, you can see there's some blue and black housing and backs onto a tannery. So tannery is obviously making of leather, so we're dealing with carcasses, we're dealing with chemical processes. It's an unpleasant thing to be around. You can quite see that if you could afford not to live next to a tannery, then indeed, then you wouldn't. Maps can have a tendency sometimes, I think, to steal the limelight. Indeed, there's a whole talk on maps. They're very attractive, interesting objects. But we shouldn't forget that quite often, particularly with these sort of maps that emphasise colour and shape, there's a huge amount of research that goes into them. We've alluded to the survey work of Booth. And just on the bottom right-hand side there, you can see a few extracts from it, referring to Melwick Place. Gives you a sense of the of what is being reported, but I actually particularly like where it says Bermondsey Place. If it's cut off, my apologies. It says Bermondsey Place, paved only cul-de-sac, semicolon, terrible children. Gives you a sense of the inquiry that's taking place. And I should just say that the notebooks aren't held here at London Metropolitan Archives. They live at London LSE, the London School of Economics, but they are all available online, and they're available in this really excellent format where you can have the map, and then you can click on an area, and you can go to the it will bring up the notebook for that section as well. So if you're interested in using this for your local history research, your family history research, it's a very good thing to do. And if you're just interested in the Booth map more generally, I can't recommend going along to the LSE project site for that highly enough. It's a truly excellent resource, a real example of how to do this, present this information well. So our next map is sort of you might think of it as a sibling to the Booth map. So this map is entitled Jewish East London, and it was published in a book in 1900. The book was by T. Fisher Unwin and Charles Russell, and it was entitled The Jew in London, a study of racial character and present-day conditions. The map itself, though, was produced by one George Arkle, who was a cab driver, a statistician, and he was part of the team that produced the Survey of London Poverty by Charles Booth. This is an interesting map. It's controversial, maybe a bit strong, but I'd like to read you a little extract from a very good book, The 20th Century History and Maps by Bryce and Harper, which accompanied a British Library exhibition of the same name about a decade ago. So they say, this map, now I quote, is a salutary reminder to approach maps with caution. Those that claim a statistical basis are not necessarily neutral. The map illustrates the density of the Jewish population in London's East End, but by focusing on the narrow area of the capital and using heavily nuanced colour coding, it contrives to be alarmist without actually distorting the underlying data. Alarmist without distorting data. That was a lovely turn of phrase. I wanted to quote it properly. So what do they mean by that? Why do they say it? Well, the first, cast your mind back to the Booth map, is the choice of colours. So I should say the colours represent the density of the Jewish population in a given area, and the darker the colour, the denser the population, the denser the Jewish population. So in broad terms, we could say with the blue and black Jewish areas and the red area non-Jewish areas. Well, remember that the black in Booth is describing vicious and semi-criminal. So there's an association that is being made there. Furthermore, the map is entitled Jewish East London, but if we look at this map, we can see more of it is non-Jewish than Jewish. So the legend on the map there is leading us in one direction. So a casual observer might even think that the red denotes the Jewish area. And then furthermore, as said by in our quote there, it's zooming in on the most Jewish part of East London. The further we zoomed out, the less Jewish it would appear. And so again, there's a deliberate framing of the picture to make a case. So it's probably worth dwelling on the context of that and asking, why is it being framed in this way? So from about 1881, or no, from exactly 1881, there are a wave of pogroms in Russia, and therefore we see an influx of Jewish population to London, and this caused a degree of alarm at the time. The Jewish population moved to London, often ended up taking the lowest paid jobs, and there was a fear that was then driving down wages for other Londoners. And also, I think it's fair to say, wrapped into that as well, a more general concern around immigration. And really, the modern debate around immigration does stem from this, from that first wave of Jewish immigration to London. So this is a time before there were any restrictions or controls on immigration. Indeed, throughout the 19th century, London was known as a bit of a safe haven. So think of Marx, think of Lenin coming to London, enjoying the laxity or the non-existence of immigration laws. And in 1905, we have the first Aliens Act, and that is in a direct response to Jewish immigration, a deliberate desire to limit that immigration to concerns that would be, I think, familiar to many of us today, whatever we think about them. Our next map is one some of you may have heard me talk about before. It's, I think, one of the jewels in our collection here at London Metropolitan Archive. These are the London County Council bomb damage maps. And they use colour in a similar way of the last two maps that we've seen. They use colour to explain what is happening at a particular location. But whereas before we've been using maps to do to describe the wealth of the inhabitants, or to describe their sort of religiosity, ethnicity, here we can see the maps denote bomb damage. This is again another composite image. So the maps are actually a series of 110 maps that have here been all stitched together by the digital artist Jurt van Kokken. But what we actually see in reality is that there is a separate sheet for an individual area. And again, what this lets us do is get us a sense of the overview of the information being presented by the map. So here, to me, it leaps off the page. Huge swathes of purple swathe throughout the city of London, and the docks and the East End. further east we go, talking kind of slightly loosely, the worse the damage. As we go further west and northwest, we can see a lot less damage takes place. What's interesting, I think, about these maps is how they can be used in conjunction with other sources and how we can use them together. So we have, again, literally thousands of these instant reports and records of war damage. One of these would have been logged for every sort of bombing incident, as they were known throughout the war. Sometimes these give us this sort of micro perspective, but if we use something like this alongside the bomb damage map, we can tell different stories, tell the same story on different levels. The 110 coloured maps that make up the bomb damage series are the result of a sort of series of smaller maps all kind of feeding in, and for some, but sadly not all, and really only a handful, we have some of those sort of lead-in maps. So you can see here one of the maps that contributed to the bomb damage map. It's Barry Street, isn't it? Barry Street near Lancaster Gate, the Paddington area. You can see how one map has been used to make the other. On the map on the left-hand side, sort of alphanumeric scripts are used to note the bomb damage, and then as we move over to the right-hand side, we can see how the colours are then used, and how zoomed in on this level, we can really see that the black area will be where the bomb fell, purple around it, and then blast damage as it goes on. You can really get, I think, quite a vivid, even visceral sense of the damage that's been done to the landscape by that pattern. Let's skip through a little bit. As happened, I've got a bit enthusiastic and tried to include a bit much. I'm sure many, if not all of you, will be familiar with the image of St. Paul's Cathedral shrouded in smoke and flame at the height of the Blitz. Probably can't use that for copyright purposes, but actually I think this in its own way is just as arresting an image. So on the right-hand side you can see St. Paul's Cathedral with only 2 orange specks on it. So that does denote damage. There is pictures of it in our archive, and others, of course, of rubble, but we can see that building is very much standing. But look around it. Look at that sea, purple and black. It gives you a real sense of how narrow St. Paul's chances of survival were, and how close we came to losing it. Much of that damage, as we can see on the left-hand side, was the so-called Second Great Fire of London, this raid on the 30th December, the night of 29th, 30th of December. So the map tells one story, but like all archives, it's sort of best sort of read against other stories, other collections as well. So a zoomed-in image from Cross and Tibbs collection gives you a sense of quite what purple and black means. So would you believe this is the view from the gallery at St. Paul's Cathedral, looking to the northwest. So we can just about make out the road pattern in the ruins there. Notice if we look at the map, we can see Paternoster Row going across, intersecting Paternoster Row is Ivy Lane, and then on Ivy Lane we can see 2 standing buildings. So you can see that there on the image. For reference, those circles, those are water, temporary water reservoirs. And then you can see in the top left of both the image and the map, the Central Criminal Court as well. So these maps allow us to understand the damage that London suffered, but they are useful in other ways as well. And in particular, one thing I like to use them for is to help me make sense of other maps. So we can see in this map that doesn't have any colour and doesn't have any shapes, actually how hard it can be to understand. So I say map, I suppose technically it's an aerial survey, but hopefully we're all friends here and we don't need to split hairs too much about what we call things. I'm not expecting anyone to recognise this section of London. For reference, it's Swiss Cottage, just north of Primrose Hill. I chose it because I used to live there, but the reason I chose that is just to show quickly how these maps can work alongside other sources. So this is an aerial survey conducted by the Royal Air Force, the RAF, immediately following the war. A very rich resource for understanding post-war London, but not the easiest one to understand, I think, without getting right. It's taken me a long time to get my eye in, and even then I don't think I'm using it to its fullest. But using the wonderful website Layers of London, I can, in this case, underlay the bomb damage map here, and we can see how the colours start to show through, and then we can make more sense of this map. So, looked at like this, I find this quite a hard map to understand. Given some clues by the bomb damage map there, as the red starts to shine, appear through, as the black and the purple start to appear through, it makes more sense. So if we advance one more slide, if I look at it again, so I was interested in this, if we see this, the horseshoe shape at the top, if we were to go east, and then this area here in between this rectangle. So that's where I used to live. This was all demolished after the war, and you can tell that was probably, I don't know for certain, but I'm deducing, because of that major bomb damage there, and then the blast damage along there. But we can also see, if we look where it's black and purple there, we can see so where that triangle is. So we've got the rectangle we were looking at before, and then there's a triangle right side of that. Some of those buildings don't have their roofs. But without the bomb damage map, that's quite hard to see. So we can see how colours and shapes can augment our understanding of other maps, and sometimes we might go as far as adding colours and shapes to existing maps, and that's what we're going to see in the penultimate map that we look at. So again, now we've had the destruction of the Second World War, and I thought we'd finish with two maps that look about its reconstruction following that that catastrophe. So again, from Layers of London, what we see here is an imagined or a recreated sea arrival card for the Empire Windrush, which of course famously arrived in Tilbury in Essex, 22nd of June 1948, and is seen as a seminal moment, rightly seen as a seminal moment in post-war Britain, as a kind of a symbol of post-war immigration from the Caribbean. So as I say, this is a modern reconstruction of what one of these arrival cards would look like. And on this next map, again from Layers of London, we can see how we can add colours and shapes to older maps. So this is the base map here, is the 1940 to 1960 Ordnance Survey. The purple circles represent the addresses given by the arrivals of the Empire Windrush, many of whom didn't yet have an address, so they were temporarily accommodated in one of the old Second World War deep shelters at Clapham. You can see the big ring around there, and from Clapham it's but a short walk to Brixton and the Employment Exchange on Cold Harbour Lane. So many of those immigrants went there looking for work and finding work, and then settled in the area. And Brixton, of course, has that very rich connection with the Caribbean and elsewhere, purely by that sort of the act of geography, the location of the shelter, and the Employment Exchange from there. A story that's probably familiar to many of us, but I think nicely brought out with the use of a modern addition of colours and shapes. And our final map uses both colour and shape in a way that I think is a very attractive image. But the more I look at it, the more I think perhaps not hugely successful as a map. Very attractive as an art object, a very kind of beguiling image, but perhaps not one that really succinctly communicates the information, although that is very much me editorializing, and I'm very happy to be disagreed with about that if people think differently. So this image comes from 1943, and it's part of the famous County of London plan. So as the Second World War was at its height, there were already plans afoot about how to rebuild London. Indeed, these were plans that had been coming to some kind of formation before the war, but the war obviously meant it was impossible to implement them. So this is from the 1943 County of London plan, famously associated with Abercrombie and Forshaw. The map itself is drawn by Arthur Ling and D.K. Johnson. A key idea in the County of London plan was it's obviously a very bureaucratic term, the neighbourhood unit. or a neighbourhood or community as opposed to you and me. The idea being, as London was being reimagined, rebuilt, a degree of order being brought to a city that had grown up organically, the unit of analysis would be the neighbourhood unit. This was envisioned of groups of between 6 and 10,000 people, and the idea is that the rebuilding of London would be focused around them, around their needs for housing, schools, shops, and other leisure activities. And the idea behind this map is to show London not as defined by its road network or its rail network, but as defined by its communities and the limits on those communities' growth. So the blobs represent various communities. In those blobs, we might see a red circle for a town hall, blue dots for shopping centres. As we go into the middle of the map, we can see the West End and the City of London are separated. It took me a little bit of looking to actually really understand this as well. But around, particularly, you can see vividly to the east, we can see this darker colour that represents industry. So once you can see it, I suppose it's obvious. You can see around the docks. So we see the bend in the river, and to the east, that's the Docklands, of course. And then going up to the north along the Lee Valley. This is envisioned as a barrier to the growth of London's communities. And similarly, the countryside in this sort of washy green colour is thought to prohibit London's growth in other areas as well. And this is where I suppose, again, the risk of editorialising, I wonder how useful it is as a map. It's beautiful as an art object, because I feel this is a map that I can only understand because I know something about London rather than the other way around. I'm not sure. If I didn't know those things about London, I'd easily to find them out. So a slightly contrary note to end on, perhaps, though we've been stressing how colours and shapes can be used to illustrate and bring maps to life. Obviously, everything is in the eye of the beholder, and a map contains plenty of colours and plenty of shapes can on occasion confuse things as well. So we'll draw the main part of this presentation to a close there. I'm very happy to take questions or comments, both from the audience that's joined us here and online. What I suggest that we do is we take a few comments in person first. That'll give those people at home a chance, if they want to ask questions, to kind of get them in their heads and get them written down. So if you have questions at home, please feel free to pop them in the chat. And what I'll need to do, because although we should have one soon, at the moment we don't have a microphone we can pass around. So I will repeat the question for the benefit of the people at home. But if I do repeat your question, do forgive me if I condense it. I condense it slightly. So over to you.
Is that deliberately made to look like an elephant, or is that just me?
So the question was: is it deliberately painted to look like an elephant, or is it just you? No, it might not just be you, but it wasn't deliberately painted to look like an elephant. No, that is purely a coincidence, and the perils of it. It also occurred to me when I was looking at one of the maps that the Goad map actually looks quite a lot like a head as well. So these shapes, these artifacts, can sometimes appear. Thank you. Other questions from yes.
The very early maps that were colour coded, given that printing was fairly rudimentary, how are they distributed in colour?
Okay, so the question was for the early maps, how are they distributed in colour? My understanding is they were just this is a time when printing is starting to become more, colour printing is starting to become more widespread, more affordable. So you could have a coloured insert in a map. So one of the things that we do see, the reason maps become more and more popular in the public consciousness is because of changes, and particularly the cheapening of printing technologies. So I believe if we look at it, and this always makes me a bit travel sick if I do it, so my apologies, I'll try not to whip through too quickly. I suppose that's a good question. So these maps were printed, so these would have been included in, and you can see how it basically was a folded insert, I believe, in the back of the book. I'm open to correction on that. But I should say that the bomb damage maps, these were never printed. So this is dye and crayon on. These are unique. This is a unique collection. So that was never mass produced at the time. Thank you. Other questions or comments from the room? Yes, Adele.
Yeah, I was interested in what you said about the Windrush generation and how they were settled temporarily in Clapham. I lived in another area that was very much settled by Windrush generation. I wonder if I didn't look at the map to see if there was another reason why that was there, which is the area from, say, Paddington, north of Maida Vale, Notting Hill, that kind of area.
Yeah, we could. What I'll do is
I'm not sure if that was on the map.
It wouldn't have been on the section that I did because I zoomed in, but I can send you the link to that. Yeah, jolly good. Thank you. Are there any questions from home, Jack?
There are, yeah. Deborah asks, do you know what use was made of the Booth poverty maps at the time?
Oh, very good. So, just so everyone heard, Deborah asked what use was made of Booth poverty maps at the time. So they were used tremendous. There were a tremendous amount of use they were put to. And here, I suppose, I'm lumping the map in with the survey more generally. They became very much a campaigning tool for improving the conditions of people in London. So coincidental with the publishing of the Booth map was the formation of the London County Council, the first really proper municipal body for London. And those same concerns that Booth and the people around him had around the living conditions of London, around poverty, were shared by many in the council. So we actually often see the Booth maps used as evidence. People sort of stand up in the debating chamber at county halls and use Booth's work as evidence. And also one of the main conclusions that Booth drew was the perils of old age in a time before what in sort of modern parlance call a sort of safety net, before a welfare system, to use again modern parlance. So many of the people that were in the lower classes had been enjoyed a comfortable life as they got to their retirement. Their savings were eked away, but inability to work. Remember, much work then required more physical strength, physical power, something that obviously departs many of us as we get older. So they were unable to work, and so it was very much also used as part of the campaign for the old age pension as well. So it feeds in to some of those sort of progressive reforms people like Lloyd George were putting in the early 20th century as well. Thank you, Deborah. Really important question. Other questions?
Not for online at the moment.
Jolly good. Okay, so if there's anyone online, feel free to type and we'll take a question from the room in the meantime.
I was doing some research around Finsbury Circus in the City of London a while ago. And
yeah.
I discovered, if I'm remembering correctly, there may be Booth maps as well, but there were kind of street maps of shop fronts that laid out on kind of either side of the road, and I was wondering if you knew of them and potentially if they had a connection with the poverty maps.
Okay, so the question was, press it for you. So, the gentleman here has basically encountered some other what he suspects to be Booth maps around Finsbury Circus, in particular, show shop fronts. And have I heard of them and another connection? And I'm afraid I'm going to have to say no on both accounts. I can't picture what you mean, but we could perhaps catch up afterwards and I can see if I could rack my brains. But I'm afraid not off the top of my head. But thank you. I'll always say no. If you have a tough question, I'd much rather say no than mislead you. But thank you for the question, nonetheless. Yeah.
I've seen something similar to the Strand.
Okay. So.
And I think it's earlier.
So it's the Tallis map.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay. So. The gentleman's question was answered by the wisdom of the crowd. Often happens. Very erudite audience here, which means you're both a pleasure to present to and a little bit scary sometimes as well. So we believe the maps in question were the Tallis maps. Thank you very much, both of you. Thank you. Any more questions at home, Jack?
No.
Jolly good. Any more questions from the room? Yes, two. So we'll go here and then here. So here first.
Recently we've been hearing about the boundary changes for the representation of MPs in London, and I wanted to know whether or not you were aware of any mapping that was used to inform how those boundaries were going to be changed, and if they were, what kind of mapping did they show?
Okay, so the question was, we're hearing at the moment about changes for the constituency boundaries, the election of MPs, particularly in the London area, and what mapping would have gone into that, and what would they show. So those I would be very surprised if it didn't involve mapping. It's not. It's a bit too contemporary for my expertise. Basically, is the thing to say. But there's no doubt in my mind that the GLA, the Greater London Authority, will feed. I'm not actually. I don't know who it would be. Wouldn't the GLA, would it? whichever organisation is responsible for that, I'm afraid it escapes me who it would be, will no doubt be using mapping. What we call GIS, graphical information systems, are now so commonly available. They'll be used that to present that. They also, I would imagine as well, will be various other census data, demographic data, what we might loosely call sort of market research sort of information to understand who these people are. It's somewhat related. I can't help but do it. So forgive me. What we're talking might sometimes be described as gerrymandering. Some of you will have heard that expression. Do people know where that expression comes from? So this was, I forget the details quite when and where, but the idea was that gerrymandering is, of course, when you draw the boundaries for your electoral constituency in such a way that it supports the outcome that you want from the election. So the original gerrymandering, it was an American, I think Senate, there might be a congressional candidate of the name of, first name was Jerry. The boundary was drawn in such a way it looked like a salamander, and the newspaper described it as a gerrymander instead. So half a story there, half an anecdote, which hopes to go some way to forgive my ignorance there. We'll go here and then we'll go there. So there's a question in the back as well.
Yes, my question is around the colour palette.
Yes.
The use of colour.
Right.
Do you think the colour palette can always tell a story, or do you think it can be neutral?
Okay, so the question was, do the colour palettes tell a story, or they always be neutral? I think in theory they could be neutral, but I think something like this, it's quite obvious why you would choose darker colours. I think to denote damage. I think it's uncontroversial that more damage is a bad thing. Those connotations around darker colours and things more sinister is obvious. But then with the booth map, of course, that is a different thing entirely. You can feel the kind of the moral judgment there. There's an interesting discussion, I think the author's name is Monomer, but the book is How to Lie with Maps. There's an interesting chapter around that and on the use of colour in maps. And he does deal with a little bit about what we bring to colours, but it's also quite subjective as well. So there are even suggestions that people of different sort of social economic classes respond to different colours differently, even along other lines as well. So I think in theory, yes, it can be neutral, but hard to do. And that's that interesting question with all things mapping, isn't it? Always presented as objective, always presented as neutral, but then these things creep in as well. How you unpick the two is always fascinating. It's why I find maps such an interesting archival source as well. So thank you, great question. I think we'll take one more question from here.
It was simply a comment that it's probably the Boundary Commission and probably the data is a queue in the National Archives.
Okay, thank you. So a follow-up from the question about constituency boundaries. Probably the Boundary Commission, and much of the data probably comes from the National Archives. The supposition from the floor. Thank you, Paul. Thanks for that. Any more questions from home?
Yeah.
So we'll take this as the last question, I think.
There's two.
Oh, we'll take two. And
One.
I'm a pushover. It's obvious, isn't it? We'll take the last two questions.
So Art Deco asks, I have an ancestor who was born in St Agatha Square, but I can't find it on any maps. Could you suggest where I could look, please? I think it's near Shoreditch from a cursory Google, and I don't think it's called St Agatha Square, but it was in the late 19th century.
Okay.
I think it might be an inquiry, this.
Yes, I'm going to pass you on to my colleagues for that one. So Jack will put the inquiries database in there. What you probably want there is a historical gazetteer around the time that will list old street names. Or what you need to be doing is basically going through old maps of roughly the time and trying to find it on that. So you're going to try and trace the name of the street back through it. One useful tool potentially could be the Layers of London website. What that allows you to do is put a modern map, so find it on the modern map if you know where it is on the modern map, and work from there. Or if you need to go the way around, if you can find an old map, and then you can work forward. So that would be my first port of call. If it's on there, that's the easy way of doing it. Otherwise, drop our inquiries team a line, they'll help you through it. But you're probably looking for a historical gazetteer, historical street atlas, that sort of a thing. And the second question?
The second question from Neil, was the bomb damage map made nationally or just for London?
Okay, so just so everyone here, was the bomb damage map made nationally or just for London? And indeed, not all of what we think of as London. So the London County Council area, which is what the County of London area, administered by the London County Council. So what we think of as sort of inner London, really. So it can be quite annoying as you go east. It kind of cuts off. You can probably see it backwards. You can see it here. It cuts off on the east. And you really want to know what happens on the other side of the boundary. Various other towns and cities did produce bomb damage maps. I know one from Barking Dagenham because I happened to work there once upon a time. So they do exist, but this particular map is unique to London County Council. Thank you. I said that wasn't so. You need to be ruthless. Jolly good. Well, thank you all for coming along this afternoon, either in person or at home. It's always a great pleasure for me to spend some time researching these collections and hopefully bring out some of their interesting details to you as well. The talk series continue. So on the first Tuesday of the month, we'll be doing a talk in the exhibition space, looking at the Agas map or Civitas Londinium or the woodcut map. So we'll be looking at that before it has a well-earned rest and goes back into storage. Magnificent Maps of London finishes on the 29th of March. So if you are interested and you are in the location where you can come and see it, please do. And the next talk in this series will be on the 28th of March, where we'll be looking at the history of London's river crossings. So thank you all for coming. Hope to see some of you there as well. Thank you again.